Robb Stark was not given to self-indulgent brooding, but on this morning, the mists over Riverrun's battlements seemed particularly foreboding, as though the gods themselves were whispering of lurking threats. He stood on the western wall, broad shoulders draped in a thick fur cloak, his hair red as the sunrise. The restless hush of the river tumbler below matched the tension in his chest. He was young but had already learned that war ages a man swiftly. Despite the unwavering loyalty of his bannermen and the fierce devotion of the North, he carried the weight of his father's legacy like a chain across his heart. The War of the Five Kings raged in every corner of the realm, but Robb knew that if he were to champion the justice his father died for, he needed allies. And that need ached like a wound. He remembered how, in the wake of his father's execution, the quiet hush in the great hall of Winterfell had been replaced by the howling of the northern lords demanding retribution. They had named him king in the north, and Robb took the crown with both reluctance and resolve. He never sought to be king, only to avenge his father's wrongful death and protect his sisters from the vipers at King's Landing. Yet in a land reeling from chaos, a man's desires rarely aligned with his responsibilities. Over time, battles had hardened him. His beloved direwolf, Grey Wind, had stood faithfully at his side in skirmishes that left entire fields soaked with blood. They had gained victory after victory against the Lannisters, but Tywin's cunning still lurked at every turn, and the endless demands of war ate at Robb's sense of hope. That hope had dimmed even further when tragedy stained the halls of Harrenhal when Roose Bolton arrived bearing tidings of betrayals from within. But Robb, wise beyond his years in the harsh schooling of war, realized that lamenting over treachery would serve no purpose. He needed a new plan. He needed an ally outside the typical lines of loyalty and vengeance. The shock of that idea still reverberated in his mind whenever he considered how far from the north he might look for such support. But Dornish rumors had drifted across the battlefields and taverns. Whispers of a fiery prince, one who despised the Lannisters with a personal vendetta, had tickled his intrigue like a spark in the darkness. That prince was Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper of Dorne. And now, against the counsel of many, Robb was weighing the possibility of courting the Dornish for an alliance that might shift the very foundations of the war. If certain lords had their way, the North would remain insular, trusting no southern alliance after the heartbreak that followed his father's death. Yet Robb's counsel included the Blackfish, the pragmatic and fearless Brynden Tully, and his mother, Catelyn Stark, whose wisdom urged him to seek any advantage to protect their family. A raven had been dispatched to Sunspear, carrying words heavy with promise but gilded in careful courtesy. Robb offered respect to the memory of Princess Elia Martell and recognized that Oberyn's thirst for justice ran parallel with that of the Starks. Moreover, the boldness of the Red Viper's reputation was a clarion call in a kingdom where every man seemed to cower before the Lannisters' gold. Robb wanted more than just swords. He wanted men who fought for righteous revenge. Dorne, he thought, might well be the greatest bastion of defiance left in the realm. In the days that followed, they waited for a response, the outcome as uncertain as the direction of the blowing wind. While the fortress of Riverrun offered him a measure of safety, no place truly felt secure anymore. His mother paced the solar, keeping an anxious vigil for ravens. The men drilled in the yard, aware that with every passing day, the lines of the war shifted and twisted like a nest of vipers. And it was in that quiet, uncertain moment that the raven returned, carrying a parchment stamped with the Sunanspear sigil of House Martell. The letter was short, every word chosen with calculated precision, but it boiled down to a single statement of intent. Oberyn Martell would meet Robb Stark to speak of forging a common cause. When Robb read those lines, a taut thread inside him loosened, just a fraction, allowing a breath of cautious relief. He had not pinned all his hopes on this, but it felt like the first step in forging something new, a chance, perhaps, to end the war with swords unsullied by further betrayal. And so they moved. Robb left a garrison at Riverrun under the Blackfish's watchful eye and rode south with a detachment of his most trusted men, leaving behind many who questioned the wisdom of relying on Dornish support. But he took heart because in these times, too much caution was as perilous as too much rashness. Guided by the unerring sense of direction known only to men used to forging their way through contested lands, Robb led them across war-torn fields and battered roads until, at last, they came near the agreed-upon meeting place. A modest keep on the borderlands of the Reach and the Stormlands. This region was still contested, making it a perfect, if precarious, location for a clandestine parley. The keep was little more than a fortress outpost, its old stones forming a single tower that loomed grimly over a courtyard too small for lavish gatherings. Yet its neutrality suited both sides, and the men with Robb could quickly transform the courtyard into a secure site for negotiations. Their banners, adorned with the direwolf of House Stark, hung limp in the heavy, humid air. Dorne's arrival came at dusk. Scores of riders advanced in disciplined ranks, the Sunspear standard fluttering over them in bright orange and red. Robb and his men watched from the parapet, noting the fluid grace of Dornish cavalry, the desert-born horses moving with unspoken ferocity. At their head rode Oberyn Martell. The Red Viper's presence was something of legend already, and Robb felt the man's reputation was not ill-founded. Oberyn was lean, radiating a predatory energy that called to mind a coiled snake ready to strike. His eyes, dark and intelligent, shone with a focus that told Robb everything he needed to know about the man's unwavering purpose. Though regal in bearing, Oberyn had a dangerous edge, like a blade honed to a gleaming finish. Robb, tall and broad with the stern gaze of a northerner, found a curious parallel in him. Both men carried the scars of great personal loss and an equally great thirst for justice. They greeted each other in the courtyard by the fading light of torches. No titles were wasted. Their first words were plain, their agreement unspoken, that they would lay aside the formalities of petty lords to speak as two equals. Two men bound by a hatred of the Lannisters. Oberyn's voice was smoother than Robb expected, holding a subtle accent that gave weight to every syllable. He said only, "You are your father's son. I see him in your eyes," before giving a faint smile and glancing at the men around them. Ned Stark was honorable to a fault. Let us hope you have inherited both his honor and a certain caution, which might spare you from his fate. They broke bread in the tower's sparse main hall, a courtesy required by the old laws of hospitality. The conversation was frank and unburdened by illusions of courtesy. They came together not out of idle politeness but out of necessity. Robb explained the cunning and might of Tywin Lannister's armies, the iron hold the crown had upon the realm's gold, and the relentless ambition of Queen Cersei. Oberyn listened with the silent intensity of a serpent tracking its prey. Then he spoke of his own reasons, the savage murder of his sister, Elia, and her children at the hands of men who served the Lannisters. Oberyn's desire to crush the family that orchestrated that horror burned in him like a fever. "I will not kneel," Oberyn stated plainly, setting aside his wine goblet. "Dorne bends the knee only to a just monarch. The Iron Throne has a debt to pay my family, blood for blood. If I see a chance to place a better ruler on that throne, I will take it." His sharp gaze pinned Robb in place. "They call me the Red Viper because I strike swiftly and do not relent until the poison has run its course. But I do not throw away my men's lives on a whim." Robb nodded, swallowing his pride as he allowed his mother to speak her piece about the brutalities they had suffered at the hands of the Lannisters, about the wrongful beheading of her husband and the kidnapping of her daughters. Together, they painted a picture of a dynasty grown monstrous. The words resonated with Oberyn, for the Lannisters had cast their shadow on his life in the most personal of ways, and so the seeds of alliance were sown. There was no formal treaty scrawled in fancy script. Instead, there was a mutual understanding, a solemn vow forged between two leaders who wanted justice in equal measure. The price, Oberyn made clear, was a role in the shape of the realm to come. If they won, Dorne would be free from the injustices inflicted upon it by the Iron Throne since the days of Aegon's conquest. Oberyn wanted restitution, autonomy, and the heads of every Lannister who had a hand in Elaya's murder. Robb, in turn, promised that if he took the throne, he would uphold Dorne's unique rights and ensure the Martells had the justice that had been denied them for so many years. Robb's mother looked at him warily, but in her gaze he found agreement. They could not afford to spurn the offer of Dornish support, especially not in a war where the odds seemed increasingly stacked by gold and treachery. Their handshake that night was as significant as any royal declaration. When Robb clasped Oberyn's forearm in a firm grip, both men understood that by doing so they had charted a new, perilous path. Each recognized in the other a certain unstoppable resolve, like two rivers converging into one relentless torrent bound for the sea. They parted, each retreating to their separate camps for the evening. But in his small chamber, on a bed too lumpy to ease his muscles, Robb felt for the first time a flicker of renewed hope. He pictured an army that combined the hardened loyalty of the Northern Bannermen with the fiery zeal of Dornish spears. Perhaps then the Iron Throne would tremble beneath them, Dawn found them riding out together to settle the details of strategy, sparring verbally as they weighed the perils of crossing the Crownlands or forging an alliance with the Reach. Oberyn had the cunning of a man used to political sabotage, while Robb thought more like the soldier he had become. Their different perspectives sharpened their plan like two stones grinding a blade. Word was that Stannis Baratheon was regrouping somewhere in the east, and the Tyrells remained uncertain in their loyalties, chasing whichever path led them closer to power. But Dorne had always been the realm's outlier. Separated by deserts and mountains, the Martells had a tradition of independence that made them more resilient to outside forces. Those same barriers would keep the Lannisters from easily stamping out Dornish resistance. When their councils concluded, Robb rode away with Oberyn by his side, heading north again to gather the northern forces for a grand campaign. The Northmen looked upon the Dornish contingent with wary eyes, but the men of Dorne held their heads high. Shared purpose could forge alliances even where old resentments lingered, but it was never an easy path. Gradually, though, around campfires and in the heat of sparring sessions, the soldiers learned to respect each other. The Northmen admired the Dornish skill with spears and their uncanny endurance in harsh conditions. The Dornish, in turn, found unexpected admiration for the Northmen's fierce loyalty and unyielding discipline. Bonds began to form, intangible but resolute as steel. Robb made sure to keep the lines of communication honest. He told Oberyn everything he could about the strategic threats they faced. He laid out maps on the large wooden table in Riverrun's Great Hall, showing how the Lannisters had gained the upper hand by forging alliances with wealth and intimidation. Oberyn studied those maps with a keen eye, occasionally jabbing a finger at a river crossing or fortress. "Strike here," he would say, "and the gold roads will be ours." Robb found that Oberyn's boldness often matched his own instincts, though the Dornishmen favored more daring maneuvers. Over time, they developed an unspoken rhythm, each man's style complementing the other's strengths. Riverrun soon bustled with renewed vigor. Soldiers from the north and from Dorne mingled in the courtyard, forging a tenuous camaraderie. Merchants came and went, providing supplies that Oberyn purchased with coin from his personal coffers. The pragmatic Blackfish marshaled the river lords, ensuring that their talents were integrated into the plan. Spies were dispatched to King's Landing, to the Westerlands, to the Reach. Ravens fluttered to and fro with coded missives. The realm buzzed with rumors, but none truly guessed that a Stark Martell alliance was forming in defiance of the crown. When the time came to march, the combined force streamed east like a lethal tide. Their aim was to circle around the Crownlands, sever the trade routes the Lannisters relied upon, and then close in with a chokehold that would starve King's Landing into submission. Robb led the main vanguard, Grey Wind loping beside him, the direwolf's keen senses alert to every shift in the wind. Oberyn commanded the cavalry and light infantry from Dorne, who rode with a certain jubilant ferocity that made men whisper about the legendary Dornish prowess in battle. In the nights that followed, Robb often found himself in Oberyn's company. The Dornish prince was unpredictable. One moment he'd be regaling the men with bawdy tales or quipping with a wry smile about the so-called etiquette of Westerosi lords. The next, he'd be dissecting the intricacies of siege warfare with cold efficiency. Robb realized Oberyn was more than just a cunning warrior. He was a man of education, a world traveler who had studied poisons, languages, and combat arts far beyond the typical knight's schooling. His worldview, broad and enriched by experiences beyond the Seven Kingdoms, fascinated Robb. And it was clear that beneath that flamboyant exterior lay a fervent devotion to his family and an unyielding bitterness towards the Lannisters. They were united, after all, by grief. Before long, they encountered their first significant test. A Lannister scouting party discovered them near the border of the Westerlands. The Lannisters, though surprised by the sudden presence of Dornish banners alongside the direwolf sigil, did not run. They engaged. When the fight broke out, Robb saw Oberyn's fearsome skill firsthand. The Red Viper danced through the chaos, spear whirling with lethal precision as he dispatched 3 knights in quick succession. Beside him, Robb hacked down a horseman who lunged for his flank, Grey Wind snarling as he tore a crossbowman from his saddle. The battle was over within minutes, a decisive rout, but their victory signaled an even greater threat. Word would spread back to Tywin Lannister that the North and Dorne had joined forces. They pressed on, forging deeper into contested territory. Along the banks of the Blackwater Rush, they clashed with a larger Lannister host. This time, Tywin's men had been sent in earnest, led by a hardened commander. The weather was oppressively hot, and tension hung thick as the two armies formed opposing lines. Robb felt the age-old drumbeat of war pounding in his ears. His banner men fanned out, cavalry on the flanks, archers ready to rain death upon the enemy. The Dornishmen formed a wedge formation under Oberyn's guidance, poised to strike with lightning speed. A hush fell over both sides before the horns sounded. Then battle erupted in a cacophony of shouted commands, steel against steel, and the wild screams of men and horses. In the swirl of dust and blood, Robb and Oberyn's strategies coalesced. The Northmen's disciplined shield wall pinned down the Lannister center, while Dornish light cavalry hammered their flanks with terrifying speed. With a fierce cry, Robb led the charge through the center lines, his sword a blur of silver as gray wind snarled by his side. The Lannister forces, scattered and pressed from both flanks, began to buckle. Oberyn's cavalry cut through like a blazing scythe, his own spear flashing as it sought out the officers among the Lannisters, severing the snake's head. The losses on both sides were not insignificant, but by evening the field belonged to the Stark-Martell alliance. In the aftermath, Robb walked among the wounded with a heavy heart, ensuring his men received what care they could. Oberyn, too, knelt by fallen Dornish soldiers, his face devoid of its customary wry amusement. Robb saw in Oberyn's grim mien the depth of his own sorrow. Such carnage was the price of war, even a war for a just cause. Yet in victory, they found renewed determination. The path to King's Landing was now open, should they choose to cross the Blackwater. But the city was a fortress brimming with gold cloaks, wildfire, and the cunning of Queen Cersei. Storming it head-on would be suicidal. So they changed tactics. Using smaller detachments, they began to raid supply lines, capturing key strongholds along the Rose Road and the Gold Road, each conquest tightening the noose around the capital. In each newly seized stronghold, Robb placed loyal men to protect the common folk from reprisals. Oberyn ensured that the Dornish contingent did not brutalize the prisoners or the local population. He needed the realm to see that this alliance was different. It was a slow, systematic strangulation of the Lannister hold on the Crownlands, a strategy that reaped swift results. Traders and merchants began complaining that Tywin's men demanded heavy tolls to replenish dwindling stores in King's Landing. Grain shipments dried up, forcing prices to spike in the city, stoking unrest among the smallfolk. Rumors filtered in that the king, Joffrey, the boy tyrant, raged in the Red Keep, powerless to stop the creeping siege without risking a direct confrontation in open fields he could not dominate. Meanwhile, Robb exchanged letters with his bannermen in the north, ensuring that the region remained safe from any Ironborn raids. He also communicated with the Tullis, the Blackfish continuing to hold Riverrun. Their plan required unwavering discipline to maintain the blockade around King's Landing, but as each day passed, their confidence grew. The enemy was cornered like a wounded lion, and with every tightening coil, Tywin Lannister's famed composure would face greater strain. Oberyn, for his part, focused on the intelligence gleaned by his Dornish spies. They discovered that Peter Baelish was maneuvering among the Vale Lords, but his influence remained uncertain. Varys, the master of whisperers, might shift alliances if it benefited the realm, yet no one could say for certain which side he would choose. But the best news came from across the narrow sea, rumors that Daenerys Targaryen had begun forging her own path of conquest in distant lands, far from interfering in Westerosi politics. That meant, for the moment, that the potential Targaryen claim to the throne was not an immediate threat. After many weeks of skirmishes and feints, Robb and Oberyn gathered the bulk of their forces near the Blackwater, constructing fortified encampments in strategic locations along the river. The oppressive late summer heat weighed upon them, the stink of stagnation wafting from the black waters. If Tywin or Joffrey planned a sally from the city, they would have to face the brunt of the allied forces. Yet nothing came. Days stretched on, the tension suffocating. Rumors circulated about Tywin forging an alliance with the Tyrells, but no such armies appeared. King's Landing, like a grand fortress of illusions, stood behind its walls, waiting. At last, a large Lannister host did emerge, though not from the city gates. Tywin Lannister had assembled every spare man in the Westerlands, joined by the remnants of what the crown could muster. They approached from the west along the Gold Road, hoping to catch Robb and Oberyn's forces in a vice between the capital and their newly arrived army. Scouts reported the approach, bearing news that Tywin's numbers were substantial, perhaps equal to if not greater than the Stark-Martell alliance. The looming threat of a pitched battle raised concern in the camp. Among Robb's advisors, the debate raged: should they hold their positions, continuing the blockade, or march west to confront Tywin? The Blackfish argued for caution, forcing Tywin to attack entrenched positions near the city. Others felt it better to strike first, choosing the terrain and surprising Tywin. Robb listened to each, but his instincts told him that Tywin's cunning demanded a proactive approach. If they waited too long, Tywin might coordinate a simultaneous attack with the city garrison, catching the alliance in a deadly pincer. Oberyn concurred, though for him the taste for battle was sharpened by personal vendetta. They decided to meet Tywin in open conflict. Careful reconnaissance suggested a suitable battlefield near a shallow ford of the Blackwater Rush, close to a series of rolling hills. Robb recalled the lessons from his father: high ground can make the difference in warfare. Oberyn recommended dividing their cavalry to strike from multiple angles, a tactic the Dornish excelled at. The stage was set, both armies would converge at dawn, with steel, sinew, and cunning deciding the fate of the capital and perhaps the entire realm. Dawn broke cold and gray despite the summer heat. Fog clung to the river, drifting in wisps over the battlefield. Robb positioned his infantry in tight ranks, the direwolf banners fluttering. Dornish spearmen held the left flank while the Northmen took the center, anchored by heavy shields. On the right, cavalry waited for the signal. The hills gave them a vantage point to see the Lannister columns approaching, endless lines of red and gold banners, the Lion of House Lannister snarling in the early light. War horns echoed across the plain. To Robb's surprise, Tywin himself was visible in the forefront, clad in gold-etched armor, as grim and imposing as a statue of some ancient war god. The battle commenced in a storm of arrows. Oberyn's archers, entrenched in higher ground, rained destruction upon the Lannisters. But Tywin's men advanced with disciplined resolve, locking shields and driving forward. When they were within range, the heavy infantry on Robb's side surged to meet them with a roar that filled the air. Shields clashed, spears thrust, men screamed. The clang of sword upon steel created a deafening chorus. Robb led from the front, sword flashing under the pale light, his voice rising above the tumult to issue orders. Grey wind lunged at the ankles of Lannister knights, pulling them from their saddles. Beside Robb, Oberyn sprang into the fray, spear whirling in deadly arcs. The battle seesawed. Lannister reinforcements poured in, threatening to break the allied lines in places. Twice, Robb's standard-bearer fell, only for another Northman to seize the flag and keep it aloft. Dornish cavalry, led by Oberyn's sworn men, harried the Lannister flanks, buying Robb enough time to reinforce the center. Hour by hour, the chaos churned, each side refusing to yield. Robb felt exhaustion gnawing at his limbs, every swing of his sword heavier than the last, but he pressed on. He could taste the salt of sweat and blood in his mouth. Then came the crucial moment. Tywin, seeing an opportunity, committed his reserve cavalry in a bold maneuver aimed at punching through the Allied center. The savage charge bore down on them with unstoppable force. Robb realized they might be overrun. In a moment of desperation, he signaled to Oberyn, who summoned the Dornish cavalry from the left. They crashed into Tywin's flanking charge, turning what could have been a rout into a swirling maelstrom of horsemen, spears, and clashing steel. Robb seized the opportunity, rallying his household guard for a direct assault on the disorganized Lannister lines. In the midst of this, Tywin himself was unhorsed, but his guard surrounded him in a desperate bid for survival. Robb's vision tunneled on that cluster of gold, knowing that if Tywin fell, the Lannister forces would crumble. He fought his way closer, cutting down a knight who interposed, gray wind snapping at the man's gauntlet arms. The swirl of fighting parted just long enough for Robb to see Oberyn lunge at a Lannister bannerman who sought to protect Tywin. The Red Viper's spear slid through armor plates with ruthless precision. Then Oberyn turned, eyes blazing with a feral light. Tywin Lannister stood defiantly, sword raised, blood spattering his lion-engraved breastplate. For a heartbeat, time froze. Robb lunged forward. Tywin parried, the clang of steel echoing in Robb's bones. They exchanged blows, Tywin's strength impressive for a man of his age, but the older lion was cornered. In a final, savage thrust, Robb found the gap in Tywin's armor beneath his left arm. The Lannister patriarch sagged onto his knees, eyes wide with shock and rage. Oberyn hovered nearby, spear poised, but no further strike was necessary. Tywin Lannister's legacy ended on that battlefield, blood mixing with the mud beneath his polished greaves. The effect on the Lannister host was immediate. Some men fought on in fury and fear, but the chain of command fractured. A wave of panic rippled through their lines, and soon the entire Lannister army was in disarray. The allied forces pressed their advantage, driving the enemy to rout. Trumpets of victory sounded. Knights threw down their swords, foot soldiers fled in terror, and the once proud lion banners drooped in the dirt. By late afternoon, the field belonged to Robb Stark and Oberyn Martell. The cost of victory was dear. Bodies from both sides lay strewn across the battlefield. Robb's face was streaked with grime, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. Oberyn, bloodied but still standing, offered him a nod of solemn triumph. They had done the unthinkable, defeated Tywin Lannister in open battle. Word of this would race across the realm like wildfire. King's Landing was now truly vulnerable, bereft of the one man who had orchestrated its defenses and intrigues. In the days that followed, Robb and Oberyn wasted no time. They reorganized their battered army, tending to the wounded and capturing what remained of the Lannister forces. Some minor lords bent the knee, swearing allegiance to the Stark-Martell alliance rather than face the gallows. Others simply fled, hoping to find sanctuary wherever the Lannister name still held sway. But with Tywin gone, that name lost much of its terror. The roads leading to the city soon filled with peasants and soldiers alike, all speaking in hushed tones about the new powers rising. King's Landing stood at the threshold of upheaval. Finally, Robb gave the order they would move on the capital not in a reckless storming of walls, but with siege tactics to remind those within that their illusions of safety had evaporated. The approach was slow, purposeful. The Allied banners formed a great tide sweeping toward the gates. Scouts galloped ahead, relaying that panic gripped King's Landing. Joffrey raved inside the Red Keep. Cersei pulled every string to bolster the walls and man the defenses, while Pycelle muttered about negotiations. But negotiations with the murderers of Ned Stark and the butchers of Elia Martell? Neither Robb nor Oberyn saw any reason to trust the word of the Lannister monarchy. They encamped outside the city walls, forging a ring of steel around the capital. Dorne's lithe cavalry patrolled the perimeter, ensuring no one entered or left without permission. Northern archers set up positions to harass any defenders on the ramparts. The once bustling roads leading into King's Landing grew silent but for the cause of circling crows. Within the city, tensions rose. The gold cloaks tried to maintain order, but thousands of hungry mouths clamored for bread. The crown's stores dwindled. Rumors leaked of infighting among the royal court. The small folk whispered that the Red Viper stood at the gates, thirsting for Lannister blood, and that the young wolf, the king in the north, was unstoppable. After several weeks of mounting pressure, a delegation emerged from the battered gates. It was led, surprisingly, by Tyrion Lannister. The imp came, flanked by wary soldiers holding white flags, requesting an audience to treat for peace. Robb and Oberyn received him in a neutral field outside the siege lines. Tyrion, gone from sleepless nights and wearing an expression of forced composure, looked from Oberyn to Robb with keen intelligence. He proposed a truce, offering restitution, gold, anything to lift the siege. But Robb's anger simmered just beneath the surface, fueled by memories of his father's death, his sister's plight, and the blood spilled needlessly. Oberyn's hatred for House Lannister was equally intense, though he admired Tyrion for being somewhat of an outcast among his own family. Tyrion spoke with all the eloquence he could muster, but Robb would not accept half measures. The realm needed a reckoning. King's Landing had to surrender unconditionally, release all hostages, including Sansa Stark if she was still within the city, and deliver the Queen Regent, Cersei, to stand trial for her crimes. Tyrion paled at the demands, recognizing them as not just humiliating but lethal for his family's power. The Red Viper added a final, chilling stipulation: I want the names of every man who harmed my sister. I want them delivered into my hands, or I will raze the Red Keep to the ground. Tyrion left, shaken and uncertain, but he carried their ultimatum back to the city. The city's response was a wavering silence. Days passed. The Allied camp remained vigilant, but tension coiled tight as a bowstring. Then, on a particularly stormy morning, the gates of King's Landing opened again. This time, a different procession emerged, bearing no flags. They came forth meekly, unarmed men in tattered Lannister colors, accompanied by ragged gold cloaks. Joffrey Baratheon, the so-called king, was among them, pale and trembling. Cersei Lannister, her golden hair unkempt, stared defiantly at the assembled banners. Behind them shuffled Pycelle and a handful of lords whose faces were etched with defeat. Their eyes scanned the ring of steel around them, the faces of Northmen and Dornishmen brimming with righteous anger. Robb advanced, flanked by Grey Wind. The direwolf's hackles rose at the scent of Lannister fear. Oberyn came forward too, his spear resting across his back, a living embodiment of retribution. The hush was absolute as Joffrey tried to speak, only to stammer incoherently. Cersei sneered, venom in her stare, but it was powerless in the face of overwhelming force. Robb's voice carried, clear and resolute: You have surrendered. Hand over your weapons. Any who resist will die. Thus, King's Landing fell without a final bloody assault, undone by the strangling hold of a united North and Dorne. The men inside the walls, weary and hungry, offered little resistance. The gold cloaks laid down their arms rather than face certain annihilation. Robb and Oberyn entered the city gates to a mixed reception. Some small folk cheered for deliverance from the tyrant boy king, while others cowered in terror, uncertain if this new power would be any kinder. Robb directed his men to restore order, forbidding looting or cruelty. Oberyn did the same with the Dornish. They meant to show the realm that theirs was a just cause. In the Red Keep, they found opulence contrasted with the stench of fear. The Iron Throne loomed, a twisted mass of swords forging a seat of power. Robb looked upon it with conflicted eyes, recalling tales of Aegon's conquest and how the throne was hammered from the blades of conquered kings. Oberyn stood beside him, silent as a coiled serpent. Then, without pomp, Robb ascended the steps. There, before lords, knights, and small folk alike, the young wolf placed his sword at his side and sat upon the Iron Throne. A hush fell over the throne room, broken only by the murmurs of stunned courtiers. Robb did not feel triumph wash over him, only the cold burden of responsibility. As he looked upon the faces gathered, some hopeful, some fearful, some hateful, he saw that his war was not truly over. To rule was to undertake a different kind of battle, one that required wisdom, mercy, and the ability to defend the realm against all threats. The next days were a whirlwind of reckoning. Cersei and Joffrey were confined to royal quarters under guard. Trials loomed for the atrocities committed by the crown, though Oberyn, with fierce intensity, demanded immediate justice for what was done to Elia Martell. Tyrion was spared for his known empathy towards Sansa Stark and for the complicated role he had played in the city's politics. He had at times worked against his own sister's cruelty. Though Robb held no love for the imp, he saw more value in Tyrion's counsel than in his death. Sansa Stark, freed from her captivity, rushed to embrace her brother. Their reunion in the halls of the Red Keep drew tears from those who witnessed it, tangible proof of the stark contrast between the old regime's cruelty and the new king's devotion to family. For a moment, Robb allowed himself the sweetness of that reunion, remembering the playful innocence of Winterfell. But his burdens lay heavy. He appointed advisors from both the North and Dorne to help govern the city, ensuring that distribution of food and order returned to the streets. Anger simmered among the Dornish, who yearned to mete out vengeance on every Lannister sympathizer. Robb tempered their rage, insisting that Dorne's rightful justice would come through proper trials, ensuring the realm did not descend into chaos. The transformation of King's Landing began slowly. The stench of rot and corruption lingered, but with each day, more of the small folk ventured into the streets, testing the new rule. Robb took counsel with Oberyn and loyal Northmen in the throne room, discussing how to stabilize the war-torn kingdom. Some loyal to the Lannisters remained in the Westerlands, but many bent the knee once they learned of Tywin's death and Joffrey's capture. The Tyrells hesitated, uncertain if they should challenge Robb's new monarchy or reach an accord. Efforts to contact them began, for Robb had no desire to fight yet another war if it could be avoided. Time came for the official coronation. Word spread throughout the realm that Robb Stark, the king in the north, would ascend as king of the Seven Kingdoms, or at least those that would swear fealty. Lords and ladies arrived, uncertain whether to kneel or flee. Even so, a crowd gathered in the throne room, packed with a cautious sense of anticipation. Robb wore a simple tunic of northern gray with a direwolf embroidered in silver thread. He eschewed the extravagant robes that Lannister kings had worn, preferring the practicality of the north. Oberyn stood at his side, dressed in formal Dornish attire. Catelyn Stark watched from the dais, tears glittering in her eyes, for she saw her firstborn stepping into a role no mother could have predicted. The High Septon, newly chosen after the last one's suspicious demise, performed the ceremony with trembling hands. Robb knelt at the foot of the Iron Throne. The crown, fashioned from hammered iron and silver direwolf heads, was placed upon his head. An uproar followed, a mixture of cheers and apprehensive silence. Robb rose and turned, gazing across the sea of faces that represented a fractured kingdom. He spoke with the quiet, firm conviction of a man who had bled on the battlefield. "I take this throne not for personal glory, nor to crush my enemies beneath me. I take it so that justice may have a place in these seven kingdoms again, so that no man or woman need fear the cruelty of those in power. My father taught me honor. My friends and allies taught me unity. Today, I swear to lead with both in my heart for the North and for all who call Westeros home." His words resonated in the chamber, a vow of a different kind of kingship. Oberyn's gaze never wavered, though something like a hint of satisfaction flickered in his dark eyes. He had demanded vengeance, and vengeance had been served upon Tywin. Now, the Red Viper sought to ensure that his sister's memory was honored and that Dorne's autonomy and dignity were preserved. In the following days, Robb affirmed treaties that recognized Dorne's rights more fully than any king had in generations. Oberyn, in turn, pledged that Dorne would stand with the new monarchy, sharing both its burdens and its victories. Yet no reign can begin without turbulence. Not all corners of Westeros looked favorably upon the change. Some pockets of resistance lingered among Lannister loyalists in the Westerlands, and rumors persisted that the Iron Islands eyed an opportunity to strike while the kingdom was in transition. Moreover, the Tyrells tested the waters of negotiation, demanding concessions if they were to accept Robb's rule. Through it all, King Robb Stark relied on the unwavering support of Oberyn Martell. Their alliance, once unimaginable, had transformed the fate of a kingdom. Gradually, the city returned to a semblance of normalcy. The markets bustled again, the city watch was restructured to weed out corruption, and the Red Keep no longer echoed with terrified screams but with the measured footsteps of a new guard. Trials were held for Cersei and Joffrey. The realm watched, aghast, as evidence of their misdeeds was presented: the death of Ned Stark, the suffering of Sansa, the torment inflicted upon countless souls. The outcome was never in question. Joffrey cursed and spat, demanding his birthright, but no one heeded a child tyrant's tantrums anymore. The sentence was pronounced: death for both. Yet, demonstrating a clemency that not all welcomed, Robb offered Cersei a choice: the Silent Sisters or the Headsman's Block. She refused the Grim Sisterhood, thus sealing her fate. Joffrey met the same end, shrieking until the last moment. Their executions took place at dawn, a stark lesson for the city. Oberyn watched with a detached scorn. He had once dreamed of seeing every Lannister pay, but as he saw the axe fall, he felt neither triumph nor regret, only the hollow satisfaction of a debt partially paid. Still, Gregor Clegane and the other direct perpetrators of Elaya's murder had been hunted down in the final weeks of the campaign. Their heads had already rolled. With each name crossed from Oberyn's list, Dorne's thirst for retribution inched closer to closure. In the months that followed, the seeds of a new peace were cautiously sown. The realm, bruised and bleeding from the War of the Five Kings, began to heal. A great council convened in the throne room where key lords and ladies pledged fealty with terms that respected regional customs. The North retained its sense of identity but now ruled the Iron Throne with King Robb. The Riverlords found a strong ally in the crown, ensuring that the tragedies of the Tullus were not forgotten. Dorne stood proudly, forging new trade routes and alliances that would strengthen both its Southern deserts and the kingdom at large. Through it all, Robb remained vigilant, personally overseeing the training of a new royal army that included both stalwart Northerners and fiery Dornish. The sight of direwolf and sunspear banners side by side became a symbol of unity that spread through taverns, market squares, and the halls of the great houses. Bards began composing songs of the young wolf and the red viper, how their unlikely bond had toppled the Lannisters and brought a moment of respite to a realm weary of bloodshed. Among the small folk, an unexpected optimism took root, a fragile hope that maybe, at last, a just king sat the Iron Throne. Yet no story ends simply. The ravens still carried unsettling tidings across the narrow sea, whispering of a Targaryen queen with dragons, and none could predict how that saga might intersect with this newly stabilized Westeros. The Ironborn still prowled the western coasts, their ambitions as salty as the sea itself. The future brimmed with uncharted perils, but for now, peace held on by a slender thread. Robb, now King Robb, often stood on the high battlements of the Red Keep at dusk, gazing over the sprawl of King's Landing with a pensive air. In such moments, he recalled the crisp winds of the north, the comforting solitude of Winterfell's Godwood. He had never asked for this. But if the realm needed a king shaped by war and tempered by sorrow, then he would fulfill that role. And he would strive, above all else, to bring justice where injustice had been law. He was not his father, but the memory of Ned Stark guided him each time he faced a hard decision. Oberyn, for his part, grew restless. Victory against House Lannister and vengeance for Elia had been his guiding stars for so long that now, in peacetime, he felt an unfamiliar emptiness. He threw himself into the governance of Dorne's interests, ensuring that the alliance they had built remained strong. He advised Robb on foreign matters, on the intricacies of southern diplomacy, and on the subtle ways poison could kill without raising an army. The two men shared a camaraderie that was nearly brotherly, both shaped by the cruelty of the Lannisters, both learning how to bear the mantle of leadership in a realm notorious for its treacheries. Seasons turned. The realm braced for winter, though none could say how harsh it would be or how soon it might descend. The Citadel's ravens carried uncertain news about the changing climate. King Robb Stark, with the knowledge that the North endures, prepared as best he could, sending grain and supplies to northern holds to ensure they would not starve. In King's Landing, he tried to establish stores of food for the city's large population. The bureaucracy was daunting, but with Oberyn's assistance, he slowly reformed the labyrinthine offices that had once thrived on corruption. Peace, of course, is never permanent in Westeros. Yet, in that fleeting calm, a generation of children grew up not knowing the terror that had reigned under the Lannisters. Songs around hearth fires changed from lamenting the war to celebrating the bond between Stark and Martell. Dorne's desert flower and the North's wolf had, by their union, proven that the Seven Kingdoms need not be riven by blind hatred or greed. Even the small council, populated now by a mix of Northerners and Dornish, found an unexpectedly functional equilibrium. The men and women who served recognized that their king preferred honest counsel to obsequious flattery. And so it was that when King Robb Stark called his court to order in the Great Hall of the Red Keep, he did so with the quiet confidence born of hardship and triumph. Standing beside him, Oberyn Martell was more than an ally. He was living proof that shared grief and a thirst for justice could bind two proud houses together. Far away were the frozen moors of Winterfell and the scorched deserts of Dorne. Yet those distant homelands shaped the hearts of these two rulers who had torn down the Lion's power and shown the realm a new possibility. In the hush that followed Robb's call for order, the lords and ladies listened. They listened not out of fear, but out of respect. The flickering torchlight cast their faces in shifting light and shadow, a reminder of the complexities yet to face them. But for now, they had a king who valued honor as much as life, and a prince who refused to let the scars of the past define the future. And in a land often deprived of hope, that was a story worth telling. When people spoke of the day the North and Dorne rose together, they said it was a day of destiny. A day when the wolves and vipers joined forces to rewrite the fate of the Iron Throne. In the months and years that stretched onward, the realm discovered that though the scars of war never fully faded, a king who had bled on the battlefield beside a prince who lost everything could at least promise a fragile unity, something that might, just might, endure the tempests to come. And if it all began with two men, Robb Stark and Oberyn Martell, then that was a testament to the idea that even in Westeros, alliances forged in blood and sorrow could give rise to a new dawn. In the months that followed King Robb Stark's coronation, a quiet unease settled over King's Landing. Though the capital had surrendered and the tyrants who once ruled from the Red Keep were dead or in exile, the city seethed with shadows. Power could never be fully tamed, and even Robb, who had spent his life learning that actions speak louder than words, felt the tension ripple in every corridor of the ancient castle. Victory had arrived as a hard-won gift, and now came the challenge of preserving its fragile promise. The new king moved through the city with the wary bearing of a soldier. He often chose to walk rather than be carried in a litter, letting the common folk see him for who he was. A young man unafraid to meet their gazes, determined to earn their trust. The small folk responded in different ways. Some knelt in gratitude for the lifting of the siege and the end of Joffrey's cruelty. Others stared with hollow eyes, uncertain if this new ruler would prove any different from the tyrants of old. Beggars lined the streets as they always did, but in the aftermath of war, their numbers had grown. While coin flowed to rebuild roads and to hire stonemasons to repair battered walls, it could not heal every wound inflicted by years of turmoil. Robb recognized the scale of the suffering, and he swore privately that he would do better than those who had gone before. But no vow, however earnest, could be fulfilled overnight. Inside the Red Keep, Oberyn Martell took to the tasks of governance like a man possessed. He was no mere princeling looking for glory. He wanted real, structural changes that would prevent the same injustices from rising again. Day after day, he met with scribes and stewards, evaluating the labyrinthine accounts that recorded King's Landing's taxes, tolls, and tithes. It had become clear that Littlefinger's financial meddling had left gaping holes in the crown's treasury. Gold went missing, funneling into unknown pockets. While Peter Baelish had retreated to the Vale, presumably to manipulate the lords there, the chaotic records in his wake posed a grave threat to stability. Robb and Oberyn discussed the matter in the council chambers, surrounded by maps, open ledgers, and letters from across the realm. The newly formed small council included a handful of Northerners and Dornishmen, along with a few Riverlords known to be loyal to House Tully. Lady Catelyn Stark attended often, her sharp mind and motherly composure proving valuable in negotiations. Tyrion Lannister, who had managed to remain alive through a combination of cunning and a measure of grudging goodwill earned by past actions, was also seated at the table, though most found it difficult to trust him. The young king had decided Tyrion might be more useful alive than executed, provided he stayed under watch. The question on everyone's lips remained, how to fill the crown's coffers. War drained resources at an alarming pace, and reconstruction demanded even more. Grain shipments from the Reach were slow in coming as the Tyrells refused to fully commit their harvest until they were assured of their own influence in the new regime. The Westerlands, reeling from Tywin's death and the collapse of the Lannister hold on power, also faced their own internal strife. With House Lannister humiliated, many of their vassals quarreled among themselves, uncertain who would emerge to lead them now that Jaime was rumored to be a prisoner in the Riverlands and Cersei was gone. Gold mines in the Westerlands still existed, but the partnership that once fueled the crown's finances was shattered. Between the war's devastation and the chaos left in Tywin's wake, those mines were not as profitable as they had once been, at least not in the short term. But with every challenge, the new king displayed the grit that had earned him so many victories. Robb recognized that forging alliances was the lifeblood of rule, no matter how fiercely he might want to stand alone as a wolf. As the days turned to weeks, he began the slow process of reaching out to the lords in the Reach, to the Storm Lords still sworn to the memory of Robert Baratheon, and even to the Ironborn. Though many doubted that the seafaring raiders would ever bow willingly to a new crown, letters were sent by Raven, filled with careful promises and a firm statement of intent. There would be no return to the ways of the Lannisters' brutality, no forced subjugation that left entire regions bled dry. Robb hoped that a measure of justice would heal the wounds of the realm more effectively than the empty threat of more swords. Within King's Landing, soldiers from the north and from Dorne patrolled side by side, forging an uneasy peace. Over time, the mistrust between them began to soften. They had fought shoulder to shoulder in the war, after all, and the daily grind of policing the city bound them together in small acts of camaraderie. Inns near the Dragonette or along the Street of Flower saw Northmen teaching Dornish songs to locals and Dornishmen haggling with northern quartermasters over the price of dried fish. It was an odd fusion of cultures, but it showed promise that perhaps the two most distant regions of the realm could find a lasting friendship. Amid these small signs of hope, a pressing concern loomed in the background. Winter was on its way. The Citadel's white ravens had not yet flown, but the Maester's messages hinted that the long summer was waning. No one in living memory had faced an especially brutal winter after such a long warm season, but the old men spoke of legends, of entire cities starved, of others driven to cannibalism in the coldest months. Robb knew the North would endure. They were accustomed to harsh winters. Yet King's Landing, with its dense population, would be far more vulnerable. He needed stores of grain, salted meat, and vegetables. He needed ships capable of bringing in supplies if the roads became impassable. And, above all, he needed the loyalty of the lords in regions best suited to grow and deliver these resources. One day, after the small council had adjourned, Robb and Oberyn walked the length of the Red Keep's ramparts, flanked by silent guards. The air tasted of sea salt drifting up the Blackwater Bay, and gulls circled overhead, squawking in the softening sunlight. The king paused to survey the city below, the patchwork of roofs, streets, and winding alleys that made up the beating heart of the realm. Oberyn studied him, arms crossed over his chest, his ever-present restlessness vibrating under the surface. "You're thinking about how we can feed them," Oberyn said quietly. Robb gave a short nod. "A king who fails to feed his people won't remain king for long. The Tyrells control the lush fields, the most bountiful harvests. We need their support, but Mace Tyrell is a man who measures loyalty by how many favors he can extract in return." Oberyn leaned on the Merlin, letting his dark eyes rove over the rooftops. "We can negotiate. Dorne and the Reach have had their rivalries, but the Tyrells aren't fools. They know that conflict with a unified North and Dorne would be disastrous. Perhaps we offer them something that appeals to their vanity, like a match that ties House Tyrell to the throne." Robb stiffened. The notion of a political marriage for the sake of an alliance was a well-worn tradition, but it stirred painful memories of his broken Frey betrothal and the tragedy that had followed. He did not relish the prospect of using marriage as a bargaining chip. At the same time, he knew he could not ignore the necessity of uniting powerful families under his new reign. So he sighed, glancing at Oberyn. "You might be right, but let me consider how best to do it. I don't want to force a union that leads to more trouble than it's worth." Oberyn's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Better a reluctant alliance than a starving city, your grace. In times past, even the mightiest kings needed the breadbasket of the Reach. We may scorn them for their duplicity, but they have the fertile lands that can make or break our peace." They continued walking until the last of the sunlight painted the city in gold and orange. That night, Robb wrote a letter to the Reach, a formal missive addressed to Mace Tyrell, inviting him and his kin to King's Landing to discuss a binding alliance that would benefit both parties. He tried to keep it gracious but not obsequious, implying that cooperation would strengthen the realm and that House Tyrell would be offered a voice on the small council and perhaps more should they be amenable. To sweeten the overture, Robb referenced the history of how the Starks and the Gardner kings once respected each other before Aegon the Conqueror swept across Westeros. The letter was sealed with the dire wolf sigil and sent by Raven the following morning. While they waited for a response, life in the Red Keep continued at its usual frenetic pace. Petitions flooded the throne room daily, with commoners and minor lords alike begging for justice, land disputes to be settled, or compensation for war damages. Robb did his best to listen, to separate truth from falsehood, and to dispense fair judgments. It was a cumbersome task. Sansa often joined him, having learned much about courtesy and reading people during her captivity. She now proved adept at sensing when a petitioner was lying or twisting the facts for gain, a skill that Robb found invaluable. She was still fragile from her harrowing experiences, but she carried herself with a quiet poise that belied her youth. One day, she guided an old farmer before the throne who claimed that Lannister soldiers had burned his fields during the war. He sought recompense to replant. When asked for details, the man trembled as he described the devastation. Robb questioned him carefully, verifying that his farm lay in the Crownlands just outside the city and that the fields could indeed yield a new harvest if granted seeds and a short tax break. After hearing all, the king granted a one-time stipend and ordered that crown officials deliver grain to him for replanting. It was a small act of justice, but the effect on the man's tear-streaked face was profound. Scenes like that repeated each day, slowly chipping away at the resentment many harbored toward those in power. As the sun set on another day of petitions, Robb found himself nursing a flagon of wine in his solar, exhaustion pressing down on him like a weight. Grey Wind, a loyal shadow, lay curled at his feet. When Oberyn entered unannounced, Robb merely raised an eyebrow. The prince carried fresh news. A raven had arrived from the Vale, bearing cryptic tidings that Peter Baelish was maneuvering to install himself as Lord Protector and possibly entertain an alliance with the Tyrells behind the throne's back. Even from afar, Littlefinger's presence felt like a spider weaving webs of deceit. Robb set the flagon aside. He won't stop trying to play us all against each other. If the Tyrells consider a side deal with Baelish, it could sabotage our negotiations. Oberyn scoffed. Then we must show the Tyrells we're the better option. Offer them a seat at the table, a chance to shape policy. They love influence even more than gold, though they do love gold mightily. Robb frowned, drumming his fingers on the desk. We also have to consider the possibility that Peter might succeed in controlling the Vale. If he does, that puts House Arryn under his thumb, or at least the lords who would follow him. Which means more complications, Oberyn replied. The Vale is formidable if unified, though it's rarely unified. A cunning man with the ear of young Lord Robert might sway the Knights of the Vale. We have little chance of controlling that from here. So many fault lines, Robb murmured. It feels as though the realm could tear itself apart if we make a single wrong move. We must tread carefully. Oberyn clasped the hilt of a short knife at his belt. Better to let me handle this in my way. A subtle suggestion might be enough to persuade certain Vale lords that Baelish is not in their best interest. Robb hesitated. He knew Oberyn's methods could be extreme, but the prince was also a master of soft power when it suited him. All right, he said finally, but keep me informed. I want no assassinations unless absolutely necessary. Noted, Oberyn drawled, and he left the solar with a bow that held just the faintest note of mischief. 2 days later, an entourage arrived at the city gates bearing the green and gold sigil of House Tyrell. Mace Tyrell himself, large of girth and boasting a smug smile, paraded through King's Landing in a show of wealth and splendor. Lady Allery accompanied him, along with Ser Garland Tyrell and a train of knights and servants. The smallfolk turned out to watch as carts laden with fine foods and exotic fruits rolled in, apparently gifts to impress the new regime. Standing behind the royal gate, Robb waited to greet them in person, flanked by his mother, Oberyn, and Sansa. They had decided to keep the official welcome cordial, though minimal in pomp, a subtle reminder that House Tyrell came as guests, not conquerors. The meeting in the throne room that evening was a study in mutual flattery. Mace Tyrell made a grand show of bowing before the Iron Throne, proclaiming that it was a great honor to serve under King Robb Stark, who had proven his worth in open battle. Robb, in turn, accepted the flowery words with polite restraint, thanking Mace for the generous gifts of produce and spices. Behind them, Oberyn stood, arms crossed, expression neutral. He and Mace exchanged a glance that suggested they remembered each other's house feuds, though no open hostility colored their greetings. When formalities were dispensed, Robb led the Tyrells to a private feast in a refitted banquet hall. This was not the lavish spectacle Joffrey once favored, but a tasteful gathering to welcome powerful guests. Wine flowed, but not excessively, and the meal included simple but expertly cooked dishes: roasted fish from the Blackwater, succulent game from the Kingswood, fresh-baked bread. The Tyrells contributed their own delicacies: honeyed fruits from Highgarden, fragrant cheeses, and wines so sweet they seemed laced with perfume. Over the course of the evening, musicians played softly in the background, providing a soothing atmosphere that allowed for conversation. The talk began with pleasantries, inquiries about Highgarden's famed roses, the new city guard, and the condition of the roads. Mace Tyrell boasted at length about the Reach's abundance, listing figures of many wagons of grain they could send to King's Landing come harvest season if a suitable agreement was reached. Robb listened attentively, keeping a calm demeanor while quietly noting how Mace slipped in the hint that he expected something substantial in return. Eventually, the subject turned to politics. The Tyrell patriarch's eyes gleamed when he proposed that House Tyrell might be open to forging a deeper alliance, one that could include betrothal. He even dared to mention that his daughter Margaery, widowed by Renly Baratheon's strange demise, was of marriageable age. Robb felt an uncomfortable prickle. He remembered the heartbreak that had followed his union with Talisa. In truth, that union had not been recognized by all the Northern Lords, especially since the war had overshadowed many details and certain Frey obligations had been left in tatters. But Talisa had died before the Red Wedding could fully unfold in this alternate path of alliances, though the user's initial scenario might shift that detail. If in this telling, Talisa was gone due to war or never existed at all, the door for a political match might be wide open. In any case, the memory of betrayal still stung. Catelyn placed a gentle hand on her son's arm as if sensing his hesitation. Politically, however, it made sense. A match to Margaery Tyrell would secure the Reach in a way no simple treaty could. Mace Tyrell, ever the opportunist, tried to press the point. He waxed poetic about Margaery's beauty, her charm, her popularity with the small folk. After all, she had once claimed to desire to be the queen for them. He reminded those present of how she had been beloved by the people when she was betrothed to the late King Renly. Robb forced a smile and offered noncommittal responses. He knew that to outright refuse would risk souring negotiations for vital grain shipments. Yet he also couldn't commit without considering the wider consequences. Lady Alicent Tyrell, more tactful than her husband, steered the conversation to the state of the realm, offering words of sympathy for the northern losses in the war. She expressed genuine concern for Winterfell, hinting that House Tyrell might provide funds to help rebuild the battered stronghold if needed. This was a subtle, strategic move that appealed to Robb's deep love for his ancestral seat. For all the gold in the Westerlands, none had yet come forth to help raise the walls of Winterfell from ruin. Hearing the offer, Robb found himself quietly grateful, though he remained cautious. He wondered if these were the words of real compassion or just another piece of Mace Tyrell's puzzle. Later that evening, Oberyn approached Robb in a quiet alcove near the Great Hall's balcony, a place where one could step away from the conversation and breathe the night air. Torchlight flickered against the stone arches, casting dancing shadows. Oberyn's face was set in a contemplative expression. He looked as if he'd been studying the Tyrells like a man might observe dangerous beasts. "They're determined to secure a royal marriage," Oberyn said softly, glancing back at the hall where Mace's booming laughter carried above the murmur of other voices. "It's the surest way to bind the Reach to your throne." Robb nodded, leaning against the balustrade. Below him, the courtyard torches sputtered in the breeze. "If I do this, it won't be for love. It'll be a contract. I know that's how most marriages go among the great houses, but I saw the cost of ignoring such contracts once. I lost half the phrase goodwill and sparked more conflict. Do I want to repeat that mistake, but in reverse?" Oberyn's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Marriage is as much a tool as your sword when you wear the crown. I can't pretend to know your mind or your heart, but from a practical standpoint, Margaery Tyrell is clever, politically savvy, and beloved among the smallfolk. She helped feed them once during a siege. She'd be an asset. Besides, if the alliance holds, we secure food for the coming winter. The city will survive, and so will your reign." Robb turned his gaze to the horizon. A sliver of moon cast faint light over the rooftops. "What if I can't bring myself to marry for politics alone?" Oberyn shrugged, adjusting the fit of his leather jerkin. "Your Grace, you are a good man. But remember, good men die in these games if they don't learn to compromise. I won't tell you what to do, but I will remind you that thousands of lives ride on your decisions. You must weigh your personal misgivings against the good of the realm." The young king took a long breath, then gave a curt nod. "Thank you, Oberyn. I value your counsel more than you know." With that, he pushed off the balustrade and returned to the hall, determined to spend the rest of the evening observing Mace Tyrell and gleaning what sort of arrangement he might accept. In the following days, negotiations continued in formal sessions. Mace Tyrell, flanked by his eldest son Garland, pressed for a permanent seat on the king's small council along with generous land grants in the crownlands for Tyrell vassals. Robb found some demands too brazen to consider, but the prospect of immediate shipments of grain plus an infusion of coin to restore Winterfell and strengthen the city's walls was too enticing to dismiss outright. He bargained back and forth, always mindful of giving away too much and insisting on mutual benefits. For instance, the Tyrells must open a permanent trade corridor to Dorne, ending the centuries-old harassment that caravans often faced in the Dornish marches. The presence of Oberyn at these negotiations was a reminder that Dorne would not be sidelined. Mace Tyrell tried to hide his distaste, especially when Oberyn proposed that any official alliance must include binding treaties with Dorne. The Lord of Highgarden balked, but he recognized that King Robb and Prince Oberyn were allies who could not be easily played against each other. Ultimately, Mace conceded, though he grumbled about those blasted Dornish roads. The question of the marriage hung in the air like a storm cloud. When, at last, Robb broached the topic, his statement was measured. If Margaery Tyrell was willing and if the terms of the alliance suited the realm's stability, then he would agree to wed her. The neutrality of his tone did not betray whether his heart was truly in it. Mace beamed as if he'd just conquered a fortress, already envisioning the Tyrell rose entwined with the Stark wolf on wedding banners. With that understanding reached, Mace sent a letter to Highgarden. Rumor had it that Margaery would arrive in King's Landing within a fortnight. The city erupted in gossip the moment word leaked that their new king might soon take a queen. Some believed it would herald a golden era since Margaery was famed for her charity and compassion. Others feared the Tyrells would overshadow the North's simpler ways, bringing too much pomp back to a city that was only now recovering from war. Such debates flared in marketplaces, taverns, and aristocratic sitting rooms alike. While the capital chattered about the prospective royal wedding, Robb turned his attention to matters of pressing security. Reports from the northern roads indicated that pockets of banditry plagued the outskirts of the Riverlands. Displaced men, once loyal to the Lannisters or Freys, now roamed in small companies, pillaging villages. To counter this, Robb ordered additional patrols led by loyal knights of the Riverlands, men who knew the terrain and could eliminate brigands quickly. Among them was Edmure Tully, who had proven himself a decent commander despite occasional lapses in judgment. These efforts began to restore a modicum of order, but the region still bore the scars of war. News from the north arrived in the form of ravens dispatched from Winterfell, where Lady Meage Mormont and other Stark bannermen oversaw reconstruction. They confirmed that the Ironborn had mostly retreated after their brief occupation, but rumors persisted that Balon Greyjoy was sending out new longships to raid the western coasts. The combination of the Ironborn threat and the uncertain loyalty of the Vale under Baelish's growing influence created a sense of foreboding. In the midst of these concerns, a ship arrived from Dorne, bearing Prince Doran Martell's personal envoy. The emissary brought missives congratulating King Robb on his ascension and reaffirming that House Martell stood firmly with him, thanks to Oberyn's glowing reports of their alliance. Along with the letters came gifts, exotic silks, intricate jewelry for Sansa, and a set of curved daggers with jeweled hilts for Robb. Yet the emissary also carried more somber news. A reminder that the water gardens in Dorne were filling with refugees who had lost their homes in the war, and that the deserts were not always forgiving. Prince Doran politely requested that the crown assist with stabilizing trade routes and ensuring that the Dornish marches remained open so supplies could flow south. Robb agreed in principle, well aware that meeting the needs of one region without alienating another was a delicate balancing act. And so the realm shuffled forward day by day. The city's citizens gradually adjusted to the presence of more law-abiding patrols. Merchants dared to resume commerce. The guilds reopened their doors, forging swords and armor not for a tyrant but for a king who sought to maintain peace. Tension still simmered, but the open cruelty of the Lannister regime was gone. In that quieter interlude, the stage was set for Margaery Tyrell's much-anticipated arrival. 2 weeks later, on a clear morning that dawned bright and warm, The sound of silver trumpets echoed through King's Landing. The walls of the city buzzed with excitement. Outside the main gate, a procession appeared, led by knights bearing the golden rose of House Tyrell. Their cloaks were a rich green, fluttering in the breeze. Some rode magnificent horses with braided manes, while others escorted carriages laden with luggage. In the midst of this royal cavalcade, Marjorie Tyrell herself sat in an ornate litter with curtains of embroidered silk, a small smile lifting the corners of her lips as the crowd pressed in on either side to greet her. Robb stood at the gate in his kingly raiment, simple compared to the flamboyance of King's Landing tradition, but it showcased the North's understated nobility. Sansa stood beside him, wearing a dress of muted blue that hinted at the stark coloring. On Robb's other side, Lady Catelyn and Oberyn watched the approach, the latter with arms folded. The queen-to-be stepped from her litter. She was graceful and poised, her hair coiled elegantly atop her head, her brown eyes sparkling with intelligence. Flowers perfumed her every movement, as if she carried the essence of High Garden with her. She sank into a respectful curtsy before Robb. He inclined his head, extending a hand to help her rise. In that moment, the hush that fell over the crowd was palpable. The onlookers could sense that the realm's fate might hinge on the chemistry, however faint or forced, between these two. Marjorie's voice, soft yet carrying a musical lilt, broke the silence as she greeted him. Robb responded politely, thanking her for journeying so far. They entered the city together, riding in procession. Banners of the dire wolf and the rose hung side by side from the ramparts. As they passed, the small folk reached out to touch the hem of Marjorie's skirts or throw flowers into her path. She received them with a radiant smile, occasionally stopping to speak with children or the elderly. Her manner drew cheers from the crowd, and Robb could not help but admire how effortlessly she won their affection. As they made their way to the Red Keep, he found himself wondering if her kindness was genuine or a carefully honed art of statecraft. Perhaps it was both. Once inside the castle, the official greeting commenced in the throne room. Marjorie presented gifts from Highgarden, casks of arbor gold, seeds for new gardens, and bolts of shimmering cloth woven by Reach artisans. Robb thanked her with solemn courtesy, ensuring the entire court saw the mutual respect on display. Later that evening, the two shared a private audience in a smaller chamber, one more comfortable for discussion away from prying eyes. Marjorie surprised Robb by speaking candidly about the nature of their proposed union. "I understand that you may not have wished for this arrangement," she said, her voice warm but measured. "But your realm needs stability, and I hope I can help provide that. I will be your queen and do my best to serve the people." Robb studied her face. She was beautiful, yes, but he also sensed a forthrightness that went beyond mere flattery. "I appreciate that," he replied. "My father taught me that marriage was about loyalty and family before it was about love. Still, I won't force you into this. If you have doubts, speak them." She shook her head, offering a faint smile. "I have no illusions about the Game of Thrones. I've been a pawn in it for years. At least here, we have a chance to guide it to something better. My father can be overbearing, but he does love me in his own way. He sees this as an opportunity for our house to prosper. But I see it as something more. House Stark is respected throughout Westeros for its honor, and House Tyrell for its generosity. Perhaps we can lead by example." Robb exhaled, feeling a weight lift from his chest. "If that is your hope, then we share it." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I'm not a man of easy compromise, but I've learned that the realm needs more than a single sword arm. It needs compassion, fairness, and someone who knows how to speak to the people as well as command them. You have a gift for that." Marjorie inclined her head in a graceful nod. "Thank you, Your Grace. I'll do what I must for the people, and I'll do my part to ensure we have a bountiful harvest. Winter is coming after all." The words hung in the air, echoing the Starks' ancestral motto. Robb regarded her with renewed respect. She was no naive girl. She understood the precarious balancing act of feeding the city, securing alliances, and presenting a united face. With that understanding in place, the path to marriage was cleared of its most pressing uncertainties. Preparations for the royal wedding began at once. Though Robb insisted on modesty, the Tyrells were determined that the ceremony reflect the significance of uniting two great houses. The city's mood brightened at the promise of festivities. A welcome reprieve from the austerities of war. Markets bustled as merchants stocked up on supplies for the feasts. Street performers practiced their acts, hoping for the attention of a generous court. Even the children seemed to sense that King's Landing stood on the cusp of something more hopeful. During this time, Oberyn's role shifted somewhat. While still Robb's close advisor, he took a step back from day-to-day matters of the court to handle a new wave of communications with Dorne. He aimed to ensure the Martells were not left feeling overshadowed by the blossoming Stark-Tyrell connection. He made a point of hosting his own gatherings, inviting merchants and travelers from across the sea, forging new trade routes that could reinforce both Dorne's wealth and the crown's treasury. Oberyn's presence in the capital was a powerful signal that the alliance between the Wolf and the Viper remained unbreakable. Of course, the realm's enemies did not vanish simply because a grand wedding loomed. The Ironborn stepped up raids along the southwestern coasts, prompting pleas for aid from lords sworn to the Shield Islands. Letters trickled in from the Vale, each hinting that Peter Baelish consolidated more power behind young Lord Robert Arryn. Further north, wildling movements beyond the Wall became a topic of whispered concern, though few in the south bothered to pay attention. And across the narrow sea, rumors persisted of a Targaryen queen making steady gains, though no one could confirm how soon her dragons might turn their gaze westward. None of this halted the wedding preparations, but Robb coordinated quietly with his generals, ensuring that a portion of the royal army would remain on standby for sudden threats. He wrote to various lords, commanding them to keep their men ready. Winter might come soon, but the realm's dangers would not wait for the snows to fall. At last, the day of the wedding dawned, bright and mild, with the hint of cooler winds in the air. The great September of Baelor, which had once borne witness to so many tragedies, was decked in garlands of white roses from Highgarden and pale winter roses from the north, an unlikely fusion symbolizing the union of the two houses. Crowds thronged the streets, dressed in their festival best, and the city watch, augmented by Dornish and northern soldiers, kept order without resorting to intimidation. In the sept, musicians played solemn hymns as lords and ladies filed in, each wearing finery that showcased their house colors. Representatives from every corner of the realm had come, Tully Banners, Arryn Knights, Greyjoy Reavers who had somehow decided to send an observer, and even a few Lannister bannermen grudgingly in attendance to avoid the crown's ire. Margaery arrived in a litter of gold silk, her gown shimmering with threads of green and silver. When she stepped onto the marble of the sept, a collective gasp filled the cavernous space. She was radiant, not just for her beauty, but for the aura of confidence she exuded. Robb wore a simpler attire reminiscent of his father's style, dark gray with the Stark dire wolf embroidered at the shoulders, a new crown of hammered steel and silver wolves upon his head. As she approached, they locked eyes in a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of what they were about to do. The High Septon, though recently installed, conducted the ceremony with due reverence, extolling the virtues of unity, prosperity, and peace. When he asked who gave the bride, Mace Tyrell stepped forward, practically glowing with self-satisfaction. Then the king took the queen's hand. The vows were spoken, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Robb swore to protect and cherish Margaery as queen consort, to respect her counsel and uphold her honor. Margaery pledged her devotion and promised to stand by his side as a partner in ruling the realm. Their words resonated strongly, partly because the city remembered the farce of Joffrey and Margaery's aborted union, and partly because these two had fought in or witnessed real wars, each losing much along the way. When the Septon pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted in cheers. The sound was thunderous, bouncing off the sept's walls and carrying through the open doors into the city streets. In that moment, King's Landing felt a collective sense of relief, as if the burdens of war and tyranny lifted for just a day. The feast that followed occupied the Red Keep's largest courtyard, chosen for its fresh air and the capacity to hold more guests. Long trestle tables overflowed with dishes showcasing both northern fare and Reach delicacies. Barrels of ale, mead, and wine were tapped. Servants flitted back and forth, carrying platters of roast venison, honeyed quail, fresh-baked bread, and exotic fruit tarts. Musicians played lively tunes, and jugglers entertained the children. Toasts were raised by lords from all corners of the realm, some genuine, others forced. The air was thick with the perfume of flowers, mingled with the scent of spiced meats. Even Oberyn seemed momentarily at ease, sipping on Dornish red wine and watching the spectacle with an almost amused expression. Amid the revelry, Robb and Margaery sat at the high table, exchanging occasional smiles. They knew this was not a love match forged by the heart, but by the realm's necessity. Yet they also sensed that mutual respect and shared goals might see them through. From time to time, Margaery leaned in to whisper, pointing out a certain lord who might be an ally or a lady known for her gossip. Robb nodded, storing away each bit of information. If this was to be his partner, he would value her counsel in a way few kings had ever valued their queens. As dusk fell, torches were lit and the dancing began. Margaery took to the floor gracefully, swirling in a circle of ladies. Robb, not especially fond of dancing, joined her at her urging, attempting a measured step learned in his youth at Winterfell. The onlookers cheered. Here was their new royal couple, forging a future in plain view of all. For that night, at least, the city let go of its troubles. Laughter echoed against the walls that had once heard cries of torment. Children played tag in corners once patrolled by the Hound or the King's Guard. The ghosts of the past retreated into the shadows. But no feast lasts forever. As the moon climbed high, the fires burned lower and the guests began to retire. Robb escorted Margaery to the royal chambers that had once belonged to Cersei Lannister, a curious echo of history, but this was the seat of queens. The next morning, the realm awoke to the news that King Robb Stark and Queen Margaery Tyrell were now the reigning powers of Westeros, forging a united front between the Wolf and the Rose. In the days following the wedding, the immediate benefit of the alliance became apparent. Mace Tyrell wasted no time dispatching wagons of grain north to replenish the capital's stores. Coin from Highgarden's coffers arrived to finance repairs to the city walls and the construction of new granaries. Knights of the Reach pledged to patrol the Rose Road, ensuring safer travel and commerce. In return, Robb formalized Mace's position on the small council, though with the condition that he share responsibilities with representatives from Dorne, the Riverlands, and the North. It was a delicate power balance that Robb hoped would keep any single faction from dominating the others. Having secured the capital's immediate needs, Robb focused on stabilizing the rest of the realm. He held audiences with representatives from the Westerlands, many of whom were uncertain how to proceed without Tywin or another Lannister figurehead. He offered them pardons if they recognized his authority and agreed to moderate taxes to help rebuild. Some accepted. Others slunk away, clearly harboring ambitions to restore Lannister supremacy or enthrone Jaime if he ever returned. Tension simmered there, but Robb chose to avoid open confrontation for now. He had neither the manpower nor the desire for further bloodshed unless absolutely necessary. Meanwhile, Oberyn's reports from the Vale indicated that Baelish had solidified his position as regent for Lord Robert Arryn, controlling the Eyrie with a tight grip. The Vale's famed knights had not marched, but their neutrality posed a latent threat. Robb drafted a letter inviting Baelish to court, emphasizing the importance of unity. He even hinted at offering Baelish a formal role in the crown's administration. Baelish's response was as slippery as expected. He offered vague promises to visit when the realm's roads are safer, all while praising the new king. Robb read the letter and put it aside, suspecting that Littlefinger would only come if he saw a clear advantage in doing so. At least the north, though far away, remained steadfast. Winterfell's reconstruction was underway and loyal bannermen were prepared to hold off any renewed Ironborn aggression. The Karstarks, Umbers, Glovers, and Mormonts all understood that their king might be in the south, but his heart remained in the north. They governed themselves with the stoic resilience that defined their region. Messages arrived from time to time, confirming that the harvest, while meager, might get them through the next year. Robb resolved to send additional shipments once King's Landing's stores were secured, for if the north starved, it would weaken his rule from within. With the immediate crises at a lull, Robb found moments to walk the city incognito or to train with the guards in the courtyard, sword in hand, sweat dripping from his brow as he tested them. Grey Wind never left his side for long, stalking the corridors at night with a ghostly presence that caused more than one courtier to startle. The direwolf's loyalty mirrored that of the king himself, unwavering but also wary of strangers. Queen Margaery took to her new duties with aplomb. She organized charity events, distributing bread and blankets to the poorest districts, and set about refurbishing the royal gardens. She commissioned stonemasons to repair some of the septs damaged during the war, appealing to the piety of the faithful. Her frequent contact with the small folk built goodwill that no decree could purchase. Even Sansa, who had once been so timid in this castle, found a new friend in Margaery. They often strolled in the gardens together, discussing fashions and stories of their respective childhoods. Sansa might still awaken at night from nightmares of Joffrey's cruelty, but she gained a sense of safety she had not felt for a long time. Despite these positive developments, Robb sometimes felt the invisible tide of fate creeping closer. Reports came of Balon Greyjoy's sudden death, fallen from a bridge during a storm, so the rumor went, and that his brother Euron had seized the Seastone chair. Stories of Euron's madness and ambition were legion, though few could confirm their truth. Some said he sailed with warlocks, others that he sought ancient powers from the ruins of Valyria. Though these tales were half-myth, it was clear that Euron Greyjoy was more dangerous than Balan and a potential threat to the western shores. Farther afield, news from Essos was fragmentary but intriguing. Daenerys Targaryen, the exiled princess, had taken cities across the sea, Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen, liberating slaves and building an army rumored to be immense. Worse, she commanded dragons, creatures that had not been seen in the world for centuries. Many in the capital dismissed the idea that a girl could conquer Westeros from across the sea, but Robb was not so quick to scoff. He remembered the legends of Aegon the Conqueror and how dragons had shaped the Seven Kingdoms. If Daenerys eventually turned her eyes west, his new reign might face a threat unlike any other. For now, though, she was far away and no one could guess at her timetable or her intentions. One crisp morning, as the leaves of King's Landing's few trees began to turn golden, Robb and Oberyn stood in the courtyard, watching the arrival of a small party of knights from the Stormlands. The men wore the stag banner, once the sigil of House Baratheon. Leading them was a grizzled knight named Ser Gilbert Faring. He brought tidings that a handful of Storm Lords who had once followed Stannis now debated whether to swear to King Robb, remain in sullen neutrality, or risk supporting someone else if a new claim appeared. Stannis himself was rumored to be hidden away on Dragonstone or possibly traveling the narrow sea in search of support. Robb rubbed at his stubbled jaw, trying to decide how to react. The last thing he needed was another pretender to the throne, but the Stormlands remained a vital region, battered though it was by previous battles and uncertainties. Oberyn's eyes narrowed. Stannis is not the type to fade into obscurity. He has the Baratheon name, claims the throne by legitimate lineage, at least that's what he believes, and he still has the Red Woman by his side, if rumors are true. Sorcery, Shadows. I'd not dismiss that lightly. Robb glanced at him. I've heard the stories. Shadows that killed Renly in his tent, flames that whisper secrets to that Red Priestess. But the realm is exhausted. Would the Stormlords truly flock to him again after so many failed attempts? They might, Oberyn said, voice edged with caution. Especially if they think Stannis has a more legitimate claim or if they feel overshadowed by the Tyrells and Dornish in your coalition. You'll need to offer them a place at the table too or risk them siding with him. So, once more, letters were drafted and sent by Raven, inviting the minor lords of the Stormlands to court, promising pardons and fair representation in exchange for loyalty to the crown. Robb realized he was learning the art of politics not through pleasure, but through necessity. He longed for the clear-cut morality of a battlefield where friend and foe stood in plain sight and the clash of steel decided matters. But that was not the world of kings. To keep the newly minted alliances from unraveling, Robb convened a grand council in the throne room. It was one of the largest gatherings since his coronation, intended to finalize a set of laws and agreements that would guide the realm's governance. Lords from the Riverlands, the North, Dorne, and the Reach filled the space, along with envoys from the Stormlands and the Westerlands. Even a few Vale Knights attended, though they arrived without Baelish. The discussions were long and often heated, but by the end of the council, a charter of sorts had emerged, a statement that recognized regional customs, maintained moderate taxes to repair war damage, and upheld a promise of fair justice for all who submitted to the crown's authority. Over the next few months, an uneasy but functioning stability settled over the kingdom. Robb and Margaery presided over court functions, dealing with disputes and forging policies that aimed for unity. Oberyn worked tirelessly to ensure Dorne's interests were not overlooked. Tyrion Lannister, under close supervision, offered occasional insights that proved surprisingly useful, though trust in him remained thin as paper among the court's more traditional members. The small council, now populated by a mix of Northmen, Dornish, and Reach lords, along with a few loyal Tully bannermen, hammered out trade agreements and oversaw the training of a restructured royal army. Through it all, King Robb Stark's legend grew. The small folk spoke of the young wolf who had avenged his father, unseated the Lannisters, and brought the realm a respite from constant war. Children played at being wolves and vipers, chasing each other through alleyways, singing half-remembered tales of the battles that had toppled King Joffrey. Margaery's presence softened the stark edges of his rule, reminding the populace that generosity and compassion would have a place in the Red Keep under her influence. The realm's greatest threat might come from beyond its borders, whether in the north with the rumored free folk gatherings and White Walkers, or across the sea with Daenerys Targaryen's dragons. But for the moment, King's Landing blossomed with an optimism many had thought lost forever. The next test arrived from an unexpected quarter. A battered ship limped into the harbor, sails torn by storms, carrying a handful of refugees from the Stepstones. They told a harrowing tale. A pirate king, possibly allied with Euron Greyjoy, was seizing merchant vessels, extorting tolls, and terrorizing shipping lanes. While not a direct threat to the capital yet, this piracy could strangle vital trade routes, fueling unrest and starving the city if it persisted. Robb met with his admirals, men mostly from the narrow sea coasts and the Stormlands, to discuss the matter. They proposed building a stronger royal fleet, but that would require time, resources, and skilled shipwrights. As preparations began, Oberyn suggested that a Dornish fleet, supplemented by Tyrell ships, might quickly crush the pirates. The plan called for combining the lightly built but swift vessels of Dorne with the heavier war galleys from the Reach. This temporary alliance at sea might also serve as a test of how well the two regions could cooperate beyond land-bound politicking. Letters were dispatched to coordinate the effort. While Mace Tyrell grumbled about the risks, the promise of open sea lanes for his lucrative trade was enough to convince him. And so the Wolf's Armada, as some dubbed it, though it included few actual northern ships, was set in motion. The final piece required was a commander who could unite the two navies. Rumors abounded that Oberyn himself might volunteer, for he had traveled widely and seen naval engagements in Essos. Yet Oberyn recommended a seasoned sea captain from Dorne, a woman named Captain Melisande, a recognized bastard of House Martell known for her cunning on the water. To placate the Reach, a Tyrell knight with naval experience would serve as second-in-command. Together, they would lead a force to the Stepstones, driving back the pirates or capturing them outright. It took months to assemble the fleet, months in which King's Landing lived in cautious equilibrium. The wedding euphoria faded, replaced by the day-to-day grind of governance. Yet a kind of normalcy emerged, markets thrived, roads were kept relatively safe, the people had bread and hope. Margaery busied herself with charitable works, Oberyn with strategic matters, and Robb with the monumental task of holding it all together. When the combined fleet finally set sail from the Blackwater Bay, banners snapping in the salty breeze, the people watched from the docks. They cheered for a show of strength that had been unthinkable under the previous regime. Warships bearing the Dire Wolf, the Rose, and the Sunspear glided across the water, each side by side, a living testament to the realm's newfound unity. Robb stood on the battlements with Margaery, observing this martial pageantry with a mixture of pride and anxiety. If the fleet succeeded, it would prove the alliance's might. If it failed, it would embolden those who waited for the crown to slip. In the weeks that followed, sporadic reports arrived that the fleet had clashed with pirate vessels, sinking several and recapturing merchant galleys. Captain Melisande proved her mettle, outmaneuvering the pirates around the rocky channels of the Stepstones. There were losses. The Tyrell commander fell in one skirmish, felled by a stray arrow. But the overall success was undeniable. The pirates, lacking a unified leadership, scattered. Some might resurface under Euron's banner later, but for now, trade routes to Essos reopened. The realm benefited from new goods and fresh coin as merchants once again dared to test the waters. The success of the naval expedition bolstered King Robb's reputation and further legitimized his rule. It showed that the crown could act decisively beyond the mainland. Lords who had sat on the fence now began to lean toward open support. The city reveled in stories of valor at sea, celebrating each returning ship as though it brought some piece of victory home. At court, Margaery seized the moment, hosting a triumphant feast for the sailors who returned, awarding small knighthoods to the bravest among them, a gesture that endeared her and the king to the common folk who served on those ships. Still, even as one threat receded, others gathered like dark clouds on the horizon. Rumors of Euron Greyjoy's cunning and the Vale's ambiguous stance persisted. Whispers about a Red Priestess fueling Stannis Baratheon's ambitions flickered through taverns. And far to the east, Daenerys Targaryen's conquests continued. She had taken complete control of Meereen, rumors said, and was forging alliances among foreign princes. The notion of dragons across the sea remained a fearful, half-mythic possibility. Some insisted that even if she did sail for Westeros, it would take years before she could muster the ships, men, and resources to challenge a united realm. Others feared that if her dragons truly grew to the size of Balerion the Black Dread, no land-based army could stop her. King Robb Stark, amid these swirling rumors, chose to focus on what was in front of him. He had a kingdom to keep intact, a fragile peace to maintain, and a council of ambitious lords to manage. When the day ended, when he finally returned to his chambers and shut the heavy door, only then could he allow himself the luxury of personal reflection. Occasionally, Margaery would be there, reading by candlelight, her hair unbound and a thoughtful crease on her brow. They shared polite conversation, discussing the day's events or quietly planning for the next challenge. Over time, an understated companionship emerged between them. While perhaps it lacked the fiery passion of stories told by bards, it did have respect, a sense of shared responsibility, and the faint stirrings of genuine affection. In a world of political matches, that was more than most couples could hope for. Oberyn, too, played a central role in the king's private hours. Sometimes he arrived late at night, bearing new intelligence from the labyrinth of spies he'd constructed. He never disclosed all his methods, and Robb didn't ask for details he preferred not to know. Their conversations alternated between the dryness of statecraft and bursts of raw humor, Oberyn's wit ever sharp. In those moments, Robb was reminded that without Oberyn's alliance, the Lannisters might still rule, or the realm might have collapsed in a storm of blood. The gratitude he felt for the Red Viper was akin to brotherhood, though he also understood that Oberyn's heart remained anchored in Dorne, shaped by personal vengeance and fierce loyalty to his family. One crisp autumn morning, a raven arrived bearing the seal of the Night's Watch. The men at the gates handled the exhausted bird with caution. The missive it carried was addressed directly to King Robb Stark. It told of strange happenings beyond the wall, large gatherings of free folk, sightings of pale creatures in the night, reports from rangers that had gone missing. The letter's tone was urgent, pleading for the realm to send support or at least heed the warnings. Most in the capital dismissed such talk as wildling trouble. But Robb, who had grown up in Winterfell, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the oncoming winter. He remembered old Nan's stories of the Long Night and the White Walkers. He remembered that the Night's Watch was the first line of defense. If they were raising the alarm, it was not something to be ignored. He took the letter to Oberyn, who read it with a skeptical arch of his brow. The dead walking? Ancient foes rising from the ice? It sounds like a child's tale, but this Black Crow is either mad or terrified. Robb tightened his hold on the parchment. We can't afford to laugh this off. My father always said the Night's Watch never sends ravens lightly. If they sense a real threat, I believe them. What do you propose? Oberyn asked, leaning forward. Robb's expression hardened. At the very least, we need to reinforce the wall. Send men, supplies. The watch is depleted. They rely on criminals and volunteers. If something truly dangerous is stirring out there, 1,000 men in black won't be enough. The Red Viper tapped his fingers on the table. That's a massive undertaking. We've just spent months consolidating power here, dealing with pirates, forging alliances. Now you want to shift resources to the far north? Yes, Robb said firmly. Because if the north falls, the entire realm will be vulnerable. I didn't believe half these tales when I was a boy, but we've all seen too much. Dragons returning in Essos, shadow assassins in the Stormlands. Old legends are waking. We can't be caught off guard. So began discussions of how to send aid to the Night's Watch, how to raise additional troops in the north, how to coordinate supply lines that spanned the length of the continent. It was no small challenge, especially with winter looming, but Robb was resolute. He penned letters to his northern bannermen, instructing them to rally volunteers and gather resources. He also proposed sending a southern contingent to the wall, though many lords balked at the notion of traveling so far. The impetus would likely fall on loyal northern houses and possibly a few adventurous knights from Dorne or the Reach seeking glory. As if on cue, another crisis flared closer to home. Reports from the Riverlands indicated that a surviving branch of House Frey had begun stirring trouble near the twins, incensed that the Starks had broken a betrothal contract and that Walder Frey's lineage had been diminished under suspicious circumstances. With the war's chaos, no one had fully accounted for how the Freys might regroup. But they had enough men and enough bitterness to harry trade routes and even threaten neighboring estates. Though lacking the cunning of the Lannisters, the Freys were numerous, a swarm of petty resentments that could explode if not carefully managed. Robb was forced to dispatch a strong force led by Edmure Tully and Brynden the Blackfish to quell Frey ambitions before they spiraled out of control. He gave them authority to negotiate or to fight if necessary. The lord who now styled himself as the head of House Frey was apparently Walder Frey's grandson, and he had neither the cunning nor the restraint of the late patriarch. War could flare again unless this new Frey saw reason. All the while, King's Landing felt the subtle tension of a realm stretched between multiple problems. The newly formed alliances might hold, but the demands were endless, a potential threat from Euron Greyjoy, the uncertain stance of the Vale, the simmering resentments in the Westerlands, the urgent warnings from the Night's Watch, and the re-emergence of House Frey's vendetta. Each day brought a fresh wave of ravens, each letter describing some new fire that required the crown's attention. Through it all, Robb persevered, bolstered by the unwavering support of Margaery, Oberyn, and a core group of loyal advisors. Whenever frustration threatened to consume him, he remembered the legacy of his father, Eddard Stark, whose sense of duty had been paramount even unto death. He thought of his mother who had believed so fiercely in protecting their family. He thought of the men who had fought and died beside him, from the frozen moors of the north to the blood-soaked fields of the riverlands. Each sacrifice fueled his resolve to hold the realm together no matter the obstacles. And so, as the leaves fell from the few trees in King's Landing, drifting in swirling patterns across the courtyards, a new season settled over the realm. The nights grew longer, a biting chill crept into the air, and the first snows in the far north dusted the towers of Winterfell. Ravens continued to fly with urgent pleas from the Night's Watch. The small council debated how many men to dispatch, how to keep the peace in the south while also strengthening the wall. Beneath the castle's vaulted ceilings, one could almost hear the old stones murmuring that winter would not just be cold, it would be dangerous in ways the realm had not faced for centuries. The final day before the snows reached the Crownlands, Robb sat on the Iron Throne, hearing petitions. A cold draft slipped through the throne room's heavy doors, swirling around the barbed metal seat. He could feel the chill seeping through his cloak. A supplicant approached, an old woman from the city outskirts, lamenting that she feared for her grandchildren's food when winter came. Robb signaled for the steward to grant her a small bag of grain and some firewood. She bent a trembling knee, tears in her eyes, offering blessings for the king's mercy. As she rose, Robb glanced at Marjorie, who offered him a subtle nod, approval in her gaze. He looked at Oberyn, who stood with his arms folded, face unreadable but not unsympathetic. Then his gaze lifted to the vaulted ceiling, and for a moment he thought of the north. He imagined the wind howling across the Frostfangs, the ancient conifer forests weighed down by snow, the wall stretching across the horizon like a frozen sentinel. Duty pressed down on him like a mantle heavier than any crown. He resolved that he would not let the realm be caught unprepared. He would see to it that if the old nightmares came again, they would not find Westeros divided and weak. Night fell on the Red Keep and torches flared against the darkness. From atop the city walls, one could see the rolling black of the narrow sea, the faint lights of ships anchored in the bay, and the labyrinth of streets that made up King's Landing. In a distant tower, a lone bard played a somber tune on a lute, the notes drifting on the wind. The city rested beneath a sky filled with a scattering of stars. The realm Robb Stark fought so hard to save was quiet for now, yet the future still bristled with uncertainties. In his bedchamber, Robb removed his crown and set it aside, the metal clinking softly on the table. Marjorie watched him from a cushioned chair, a book resting on her lap. He joined her, leaning down to brush a kiss across her brow. For a moment, the weight of kingship receded, leaving only a husband and wife taking comfort in a fleeting moment of tranquility. They had done much, yet so much more lay ahead. Tomorrow, the ravens would come again, carrying tidings of war or alliances, of friend or foe. But tonight, in the hush of the Red Keep, the king in the north, now king of the Seven Kingdoms, allowed himself a single sigh of relief before the battles of diplomacy and survival began anew. Winter was coming, and so were threats from every corner of the map. But at least now the Iron Throne was held by a man who had learned from his father the value of honor and from his allies the necessity of cunning. He was tempered by loss, guided by love for his family, supported by an alliance none had believed possible. Wolves, vipers, roses, and rivermen all stood behind him. And if the cold winds were rising, then Robb Stark would meet them head-on, dire wolf and sun spear at his side, forging a path through the ice and the darkness toward a dawn of his own making.